when we go into the antebellum period, there is a lot going on there. So between the Missouri Compromise and the American Civil War, this period 1820 to 1860. And so as far as that goes, that's the antebellum period. Now, this is really seeing the United States, like, really over this time, I think there is more of a transition than in any other time in U.S. history from an aristocratic republic to a democratic republic. Now, we can remember the era of good feelings. Like, as far as James Monroe, when he was reelected by a nearly unanimous margin, this is something that it wasn't like that was a democratic election. These were, you had basically after the demise of the Federalist Party, then everybody's getting together and they're voting. Not everybody. I mean, the people that are in Congress. So basically, in a one-party system, the members of Congress are like, you know what, James Monroe's doing an okay enough job. We'll let him have another term. And so the aristocratic elite decided that it's okay for James Monroe to do another term. Now, remember, of course, James Monroe reached out to New England, to the people who had not voted for him during the era of good feelings. All right. So he had, reached out to people, and there was kind of consensus there. Now, of course, when in the election of 1824, when Andrew Jackson's running against John Quincy Adams, then we start to see the beginning of democratic culture in America. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at the differences here between an aristocratic and a democratic republic. Okay, so when you look at 1820, the era of good feelings, there's James Monroe. Now, 1860, this is what a democratic election looks like. Okay, that democratic elections can get kind of messy, much more so than aristocratic elections, where people can kind of, okay, well, this guy's doing a good job. The elite can kind of pick, so, and when we ask why the American Civil War, and we look at the number of causal factors leading to that, this is really happening as the United States is reaching its maturity as a democratic republic. And so as far as that, let me go ahead and think about this, where really the before 1820, what the framers set up was something that was very aristocratic. Now, of course, you've got the House of Representatives where people can vote, at least people who own property, they get to vote. Okay, so that's pre-1820, a republic that is aristocratic and federal. Now, of course, what you're seeing here is 1820 to 1860. Are we going to continue as this aristocratic and federal republic, or are we going to become more democratic and more national? And so post-Civil War, I would say that now, although we still have remnants of aristocracy and federalism, neither one of those things is totally dead in this country. After the Civil War, we see a country that is much more democratic and national as far as its government. And so as far as that, when we look at what is a Republican form of government, okay, and basically the government's authority comes from the people. Now, in an aristocratic republic, elites govern on behalf of the people. And then in a democratic republic, people are actively involved in governing. And so as far as that's concerned, in an aristocratic republic, a small elite visibly governs, where, property requirements for voting, indirect presidential balloting, where you had essentially in the earliest presidential elections, the electors were chosen by the state legislatures. Popular campaigning was frowned upon, and rhetoric was typically kept within respectable limits. Now, that is not to say that there weren't some pretty nasty things said at various times during the first party system, but it was mostly restrained between aristocrats, and also consensus and deal making among elites and between groups. And this is something, if some of y'all who are studying like the Jeffersonian period, and you think about the corrupt bargain, that the corrupt bargain, so-called, was deal making. Like, okay, well, I'm going to make sure my votes go to you, and then I'll be Secretary of State, Henry Clay thinks. Well, you can't really do that in a democratic republic, which is really what's shaping up after 1828. And so all citizens participate politically in this republic. There is universal suffrage within the citizen body. So we start to see that even people who don't own property are able to participate in the government. Direct presidential balloting, people are voting. So today, in the Electoral College, it is not a national Democratic election, but there are 51 distinct Democratic elections that take place, and the results of those elections are tallied up according to the formula that we've seen handed down from the framers. So although it's not a national Democratic election, every state determines its electors by a Democratic vote in that state. And then there's popular campaigning. Demagogues pander to the masses. And finally, and this is something I think we can see in our society today, you think about where's Henry Clay today in today's political culture. We can't seem to make any deals or to compromise, but a democratic republic is much more about partisanship and winner take all, and deal making becomes politically difficult because you have these two sides. And I would say that during the Jacksonian period, during the antebellum period, which the Jacksonian period is kind of the first part, that this is what we're seeing here is this transition. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question about political culture. And then I've got a video that addresses this in a little bit more detail, a little bit more fully. Okay. Can I explain the major events within the market and industrial revolutions? Okay, so yeah, we've got a good many of you have gone beyond. You've gone to Madison. It looks like some people here are studying Jackson. A lot of people have not answered the poll, so we want to make sure we talk about Madison, the War of 1812, at some point. But the market and industrial revolutions. Okay, so let me go ahead. These aren't very pretty slides, but this is something I'm kind of working on, so it's not pretty, but there is some of the stuff that I've got here. It's kind of the basis for what you're talking about as far as these revolutions that we're seeing. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you here, and we've got this antebellum period, 1820 to 1860. Now, of course, there's the westward expansion of the United States. We see increasing sectionalism in the North, the South, and the West. Debates over mostly the expansion of slavery, not so much slavery in the abstract, but also this economic development and diversity, the rise of market capitalism, industry versus agriculture, and of course, trade. So let's take a look at some of the new technologies. All right. So the new technologies that are coming out here are steamboats become the primary mode of mass freight transportation. Now, before that, people would put their crops onto barges, and you can only go downriver with those. Steamboats can also go upriver. So that's one of the new technologies that's happening here. Turnpikes, which are toll roads. Now, some places use the word turnpike today to use a toll road. So some of y'all are familiar with this, but a turnpike. Now, the thing is, it's kind of like in a parking garage where they've got those spikes that'll come up. You could call those pikes. And so what would happen is you see gates with like the little pikes on top of them. And what happens here is when you pay the toll, the pike turns. So it's a turnpike. So then the gate opens and you can go onto that road. So we're starting to see better roads. Also, canals are becoming a thing, and a lot more of these artificial rivers, and then railroads. Now, what we need to note about railroads is that railroads were not really a major factor until the 1850s, and an even greater factor after the Civil War. But before the 1850s, we're not really going to be talking about railroads in the United States as a serious form of transportation. Now, another thing we're seeing at that time is the cotton gin. So those are new technologies there. Now, when we talk about the rise of market capitalism, okay? So as far as that, now capitalism is, of course, a loaded term, but it's what we tend to use for this sort of thing, that we start to see investment of capital in business enterprises. Now, this is the sort of thing that Hamilton was wanting. He's kind of forward thinking here, but it really wasn't taking place in a large scale until this time when you start to see this antebellum period in the 1820s, and we start to see more corporations. Now, corporations offer limited liability and the ability to combine investments. Now, what I'm talking about here is when we incorporate, what happens here is if you've started a steamship corporation, corporation, then if you just own it, then if you're sued and you're found liable or negligent, then they could take all of your personal money. You create a corporation, and only the money that's been put into the corporation can be taken from it. So if I invest $1,000 in the steamship corporation, then that's going to be that. Okay. So nobody, now I could lose my $1,000, but I'm not going to lose anything else. And this makes someone more likely to invest. Now, of course, there are some times when people, and sometimes corporations deserve to be criticized, but the very idea of a corporation actually helps the economy and helps investment, because without corporations, people wouldn't be willing to put their name on something and hold themselves personally liable, but they can buy shares of stock in a corporation and only risk what they've invested. So this is going to result in a greater amount of business enterprise than you would have had without corporations. Then we start to see emphasis on the self-made man. And so when we define this period with Andrew Jackson, we're really seeing someone who we don't even really know for sure. Was Andrew Jackson born in South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee? Like, where exactly? I think that technically they think he was born in South Carolina, but it's not like people know. It's not like Jackson came from a family of means. So Jackson was a man who was born into a very humble situation and made something of himself. And so the conditions are there if somebody's willing to work hard and take risks and has a bit of luck and is willing to go out west and chance it on the frontier, then they can make a fortune or a name for themselves. So Andrew Jackson was really the first president that we had that didn't come from a noteworthy family in Virginia or Massachusetts. Andrew Jackson was somebody that was self-made. And the idea at this time, of course, we see people say the same thing today. There are plenty of Americans who agree with this assessment today, but there was a consensus largely at this time that the best way for someone to be able to advance themselves was through limited government interference. Okay, so the abolition of economic privilege and equality of opportunity. So, like when Jackson is taking on the bank, Jackson felt like the bank was a quasi-government corporation, and that this bank as a quasi-government corporation is giving advantages to the rich and the powerful. And so really the only way to avoid giving advantages to the rich and the powerful is to get the government out of the economy to the extent that that can happen. Okay. And so as far as that, whereas when you think about the rise of corporations, that's something that is very Hamiltonian. But as far as the view of what the economy should be and what is fair, that Jefferson and Jackson is really taking over the Jeffersonian positions here. And we see the beginning of the second two-party system. We see that, okay, so, basically Jeffersonian ideas about the role of government in the economy, and then Hamiltonian ideas about expanding business. And so as far as that, the idea later on, we'll see from the progressives that progressives believe that government can play a positive role in creating a more fair system. But as far as that goes, at this time, the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian kind of laissez-faire mentality is that when government gets involved in the economy, then it accentuates the privileges already held by elites. And then, of course, always a good time to review Henry Clay's American system: a national bank, internal improvements, meaning government-funded infrastructure projects, and a protective tariff to protect American industry. And so Henry Clay, of course, this is a Hamiltonian plan, but it's proposed by Henry Clay, who was a war hawk, somebody who rushed into the War of 1812 and realized, whoa, we could have really used some of this stuff. It would have helped us to make war. And that's something that Henry Clay becomes a big part partisan of later on, even though he was from a more Jeffersonian background. Now, of course, this will also be at the heart of the nullification crisis, because you have this protective tariff, the tariff of 1828, which was the highest tariff in the history of the United States. So with that, those are, I think, the main things as far as answering this question about what's going on with the market and industrial revolutions. Now, somebody's name that you might want to remember is Samuel Slater, who basically memorized the plans for a factory in England and brought them over to the United States. Now, we don't see the kind of massive industrialization that we see after the Civil War, but in Massachusetts, you do start to see a lot of textile mills. And Lowell, Massachusetts, especially if some of y'all are in New England, you probably talk about that a bit more. But industrialization is not necessarily before the Civil War, like taking root like throughout the country, but really in New England more than anything else. All right. And so as far as that goes, all right, something about the Louisiana Purchase. Luke, in what way did the Louisiana Purchase help to create an American national identity? Now, one thing we have to appreciate here is, of course, the westward expansion of the United States, the so-called Manifest Destiny. And Frederick Jackson Turner, okay, who was a historian in the late 19th, early 20th century, Frederick Jackson Turner believed that the frontier is what really made America American, okay? That the first colonists who got there were more European. I think there's some validity to this, even though historians take issue with bits and pieces of it. But the idea that we can that as we go west, it becomes more American, it becomes less European. And so the Louisiana Purchase, now, Jefferson saw this as a way to promote agriculture. So, Jefferson believed, and this is very important here, that it's not that farming was helpful for a republic, but he believed that agriculture and the agricultural lifestyle, the agricultural existence, was essential for a republican form of government. He believed that if the United States became full of factories like Europe, that it would become corrupt like Europe. So, of course, Jefferson had really a self-inflicted dilemma, because Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, was like, no implied powers at all. All right, we're going to have no implied powers, that only what's in the Constitution, super strict construction. And so Jefferson takes this a little far. He's like, people criticize him for betraying his principles, but there are some times where your principles are just a little bit too much, okay? And so Jefferson wanted to amend the Constitution to allow for a land purchase. There was nothing in the Constitution that allowed the government to purchase land, okay? That allowed the government to purchase land, but there's the treaty making power. And most of the time when treaties are made, land changes hands, okay? But to Jefferson, that's an implied power, even though to you and me, that just seems like common sense. If there's the power to make treaties, what government would be like forbidden from adding land to the country? Okay, that's kind of ridiculous. Jefferson's being a bit ridiculous. And so as far as that goes, Jefferson is being a little bit ridiculous. And there's people telling that basically you're not going to be able to amend the Constitution. And so Jefferson realizes that I've got to choose between the Constitution and the future of the Republic, which he believed counted on agriculture. And Jefferson, with the Louisiana Purchase, it's guaranteeing that, like, New England is not going to define America. The Northeast is not going to define what America is. All these new farmlands at 3 cents an acre, and just great stuff for Jefferson. So Jefferson does, in his mind, bend the Constitution just a little bit, because he believes that it is essential to the survival of Republican government. And so I think that, when you look at Frederick Jackson Turner's work, that the frontier is really an essential part of the American identity, that most of us have some sort of ancestor that moved west at some point. I live in South Carolina, but even people in upstate South Carolina, somebody might have moved west. This was a frontier where I live at one point. But I've got family that lived in Arkansas and Louisiana. So even those people moved west. A lot of people are in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Washington, and Oregon. That's really creating these conditions for an American national identity that's going to go beyond what was just there at first. And then, like I was talking about, you had this whole, like, you know, these very comfortable Eastern states and this kind of federal system. The United States we're a union, not a nation. And so I think that that, you know, has that whole idea in bringing about this manifest destiny, the idea that that the United States is divinely ordained to expand. All right. So as far as that goes, Luke, you're on a roll today. People are upvoting you. Now, y'all remember, we've got 29 people in here. So make sure you go in here and you go ahead and ask your questions. Okay. You go ahead and ask your questions. All right. So as far as that goes, what change did the War of 1812 bring to America and Canada, Britain? Okay, let me go ahead and ask here, what was the War of 1812? Okay, so the War of 1812 was a war between the United States and Great Britain that lasted from 1812 to 1815. And so this war was over. Now, it had some provocations, the impressment of American sailors, and then the arming what a lot of people in the West saw as the British arming Indians on the Western frontier. Also, the United States believed that they had neutral rights. Okay, they had the right to trade across the ocean because they weren't involved in the Napoleonic Wars. So Americans believed that the British had violated neutral rights. They were impressing our sailors, meaning they were forcing them off American ships to serve in the Royal Navy. And then, of course, some unrest with the Indians on the Western frontier that a lot of Americans believed was being stoked by the British. Now, of course, there are also some other issues, like the United States not being able to accept that Canada doesn't want to be a part of the United States, okay, and that sort of thing. All right, so I am, with that, let me go ahead and go to the War of 1812. Okay, so what change did the War of 1812 bring to America and Canada, Britain? Okay, so Jackson, you've got nationalism. Okay, now, of course, the Battle of New Orleans. Let's see. Let me just pull something up real quick. All right, but the Battle of New Orleans, it made people very patriotic. Like, even though the War of 1812 for a large part was a disaster, it ended well. And we tend to remember the beginning and the end of everything that happens, okay? The beginning and the end of everything that happens. And so Andrew Jackson, when he defeated the British at New Orleans, everybody's like, yeah, you know, that sort of thing. So as far as that goes, that's something that is important. Now, also, the United States was like, okay, we're done trying to take over Canada, because the United States launched a failed offensive into Canada. Remember, the Articles of Confederation said that if Canada wanted to get into the United States, they could get in without a vote. All that they needed to do was say that they wanted to join us. And so we never really got over that. So the British are realizing that America is independent, and they're accepting that. And Americans are accepting that, okay, Canada, that's going to be British, and that's not going to be part of our country. So that's important, but also the spirit of nationalism that comes about. And remember that Madison, the same president who had allowed the Bank of the United States to expire in 1811, rechartered the bank in 1816, okay, chartered the Second Bank of the United States. Madison, who in the 1790s had argued that the bank was unconstitutional, Madison also signed the Tariff of 1816, which was the first proper protective tariff, where the rates were obviously beyond what the government needed to raise revenue, because Madison and other Republicans felt like we needed to invest in manufacturing. That we saw that the War of 1812 kind of showed that this Jeffersonian economic model, where it was like things are going back and forth across the ocean, and we're counting on trade with Europe as a vital part of our economy, that didn't seem to be working. And so Henry Clay's American system is advocating that, hey, let's become self-sufficient. Now, of course, not everybody's on board with that, especially if you grow cash crops for export, like in South Carolina and most other southern states. All right. So can we interplay? Okay, explain the interplay between American, French, and British diplomacy leading up to the War of 1812. Okay, William, we might be getting a little bit deep into the weeds there, bringing the French in. But when you need to understand, anybody who's taken AP Euro might remember the Napoleonic Wars. And what happened here is the British blockaded the European continent. Okay, so they blockaded the European continent. And then in return, Napoleon had the continental system where European countries were banned from trading with the British. And so, as far as that goes, as far as American, French, British diplomacy, what was happening was the British were not letting the United States trade with the continent, trade with France. And then the French, now, of course, there was some bad blood with the French in the 1790s, but really the French, for purposes of a survey level course, I wouldn't worry about the French too much as far as the War of 1812, but you do need to remember like the quasi-war in like 1798 and the stuff that's going on there, but I would not really put the French in as far as the War of 1812 as a factor for this course. I'd focus on the Americans and the British. All right. So as far as what we've got here, now this was a big part of our last week's broadcast. Now, as far as I've been told by Fiveable, these live broadcasts will continue to be free through the month of October. Now, if you want access to the archived broadcasts, then those are for subscribers only. Now, right now, I think you can subscribe for the whole year for like $15, if I'm not mistaken. So, that's a great deal for anybody who wants to keep having these reviews, access to the archives and all that. But we talked about this at great length last time. But really, I've also got a video on YouTube. If you go to my YouTube channel, just put into YouTube Jefferson versus Hamilton. It'll be one of the first videos that comes up. And so I'm going into really an exhaustive kind of thing here. But the Bank of the United States is a big deal because the Jeffersonians are, of course, strict constructionists, and then the Hamiltonians are loose constructionists. The Jeffersonians are laissez-faire. They don't want government to have a role in the economy, whereas the Hamiltonians want to see economic development. Okay, they want to see economic development. So as far as that goes, then you've got, of course, the bank. Okay, the bank's not in the Constitution, and also the bank represents government intervention in the economy, which the Jeffersonians are against, the Hamiltonians are for. All right, so as far as that, but remember, I've got a video on YouTube that goes into that in a little more detail, and we've got last week's archived broadcast. All right, so the difference between soft money and hard money supporters. Okay, so Katie, as far as this goes during the bank war, okay, Andrew Jackson was a fan of hard currency. Okay, by hard currency we mean like gold and silver, specie. Okay, so basically the Jacksonians want hard currency, whereas there are some who are fans of paper money. Okay, paper money that's not necessarily backed by anything, which is, of course, the money that we have today. Like our dollars are not backed by gold. They're backed by the government's guarantee. The government says they're worth something, so we do that. Okay, we're like, okay, it's worth something. There you go. And we just basically trust the government not to print too much money. And so far, so good lately. All right. So as far as that goes, but soft money means that there's nothing backing it up, whereas hard money is that every one of these notes is backed by gold or silver. Okay. So there's some sort of precious metal, there's some sort of hard currency that's backing it up. And Jackson was a big hard money guy. Okay, as far as what manifest destiny is, all right, so we're starting to kind of get into the expansion of the United States. Manifest destiny is this idea. Now, remember, manifest means obvious. All right. So it's obvious. Destiny means it's divinely ordained. So the United States has an obvious destiny to spread to the west, basically to go to the Pacific Ocean. And remember that our original borders stopped at the Mississippi River. Now, the Louisiana Purchase really started the ball rolling there, because now the United States is expanding and really nearly to the Pacific Ocean right there. And so then the United States starts thinking in terms of, all right, we want to get as much land as we can because we are meant to expand. Okay. We are meant to occupy this North American continent, or as much of it as possible. So remember that manifest destiny has to do with this common belief that the United States is somehow fated to expand. Okay. So let's see, let me go into this painting real quick. Even though this is a painting that's actually from the 1870s, but it is something that I think is worth taking a look at, because it really oh wow, they've actually done a good restoration now. It was a lot, like, it seems to get better every time I look at it. But let's go ahead and take a quick look here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all so that we can take a look at this painting. All right. So let's see. We are sharing now. All right. So when we take a look at American progress, you see in the middle where you've got Lady Liberty here. She's holding a school book, telegraph cables, choo-choo trains are behind her, ships. You see farming and a stagecoach. You see the Pony Express and the pioneers going out in front of her. And as you see here that white America is moving west, of course, there's the light that's behind her. And then ahead of her is the darkness. So you see the Indians, the buffalo, and then, of course, this bear here. And so what's happening is this idea that this stuff here, this stuff is meant to go away. This stuff here, this stuff is meant to spread. And this image really captures the whole idea of what manifest destiny is, that the light of America is supposed to spread all across the continent. All right, so as far as the Panic of 1819, let me go ahead and note here that I don't see the Panic of 1819 anywhere in the APUSH course description. This is something like, there are panics, and you don't necessarily have to know all of this stuff and know every little detail for the exam. Okay, so as far as that goes, what effect did it have on American society, economy, politics? I wouldn't say like an incredibly meaningful effect, given that it was in the middle of the era of good feelings. Okay, so this is really like, it's getting kind of beyond the scope of this survey level course, because what happens is when you've got the reintroduction of the Bank of the United States, you've got some stuff going on in the financial system, that there is some fluctuation there, and that's that. Okay, so as far as that goes, I just would not put a lot of stock in that. Now, if we're talking about like the panic of like 1837 and 39, not that you need to know the intricate details of that, but those resulted in Martin Van Buren, but also those followed Jackson getting rid of the bank. So there was an economic panic that followed the bank being rechartered, and an economic panic that followed the bank being extinguished again. So anytime there is a change in the financial system, there's going to be some kind of disruption. But given that this was right in the middle of the era of good feelings, I don't think, I mean, it's not really, I just wouldn't put a lot of stock in the Panic of 1819 as something that's really worthy of your attention in APUSH, unless your teacher tells you it is. Now, if your teacher tells you this is a big deal for my class and I'm going to put an item on the test about it, then go right ahead. Okay. But I don't really see this as a major issue or something I'd focus on in APUSH. Jackson, that is a very kind question, but I have been teaching this subject, I guess, for some time. I mean, I do this for a living. So that's, my brother's actually, sometimes my brother will call with his friends and be like, hey, can you name all the presidents? And I'm like, yeah, let me give it a shot. And people are like, whoa, how can you do that? I'm like, it's my job. So that's where we are. All right. So all of the questions have been answered so far. Now let me go ahead and put out a last call If there's anybody else that has a question for me, because we do have a little bit more time. And, but then again, if all your questions have been answered, then great. We had a good session, and we'll be getting together again next week. And I presume that we'll be focusing on the Jacksonian, the age of Jackson would be my guess. So y'all go ahead and let me know if y'all got anything y'all want to say on the way out. Let's go ahead and get the chat going. If there are any questions last minute, go ahead and get those to me. Okay, so we've got this here. Now, Katie, as far as what effect did the economic revolution have on women? Now, remember, let's avoid, that's a great thing. No matter what you've got here, let's avoid anytime you're doing a DBQ and LEQ thinking, oh, women just cooked and cleaned and da-da-da-da-da, because they didn't. You think about this in Lowell, Massachusetts. There were all these textile factories. A lot of young women, even involving some Irish immigrant women, are working in these factories. So the factory jobs are something that is definitely, these factories are employing women. These are not great jobs, oh, I want that job, but that there are women that are working in these capacities in these factories. So I would say that you've got an effect on women there, in the sense that they're the ones working in these factories. All right, so the significance of Jay's Treaty. Okay, Jay's Treaty. Now, Jay's Treaty, that was, of course, a treaty during the Washington administration. It was a treaty with Britain. It gave Britain most favored nation status, which means that we have no trade barriers with them. We're giving them preferential treatment when it comes to trade, in return for the British basically doing some things that they already said they were going to do after the American Revolution. They still had forts in our country and stuff like that. So it was really a one-sided treaty. It was very, very unpopular in the United States. People were burning effigies of John Jay. So this is something, and then the treaty passed the Senate 20-10, which was exactly what was needed, because a treaty needs 2/3 of the Senate in order to pass. So if one more person voted against Jay's Treaty, if it had been 19-11, it would not have passed. So a very controversial treaty that was seen as being too pro-British, especially by the Jeffersonian Republicans. All right, so with that, now make sure I've got a video on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Tom Ritchie, or you can just type in on YouTube, George Washington's Foreign Policy, and Jay's Treaty is part of that. All right, so the NIP acronym. Okay, so Madeline, what we want to note is that Henry Clay's American system is really something that is going on between the War of 1812 and the American Civil War. And there's tension between Henry Clay's American system and those who want that, like the Whig Party. They're the promoters of Henry Clay's American system. And then the Democratic Party, which is laissez-faire, anti-bank, for a lower tariff. Okay, so the Whigs, they want government intervention in the economy. They want internal improvements. Okay, they want the national bank, and they want a protective tariff so that American industry can grow. Now, also next week, I'm sure we'll be probably focusing on Jackson if I'm kind of reading the room right. But the nullification crisis is, of course, a product of Henry Clay's American system. But throughout the antebellum period, the Democratic Party is in power for most of it. Okay, there's only a very, very small window where the Whigs controlled, I believe it was after the 1840 election, where briefly the Whigs controlled the presidency, the Senate, and the House. But the Democratic Party was definitely like the bigger party during this time, really the dominant party in American politics. So, but yes, Henry Clay's American system was after the War of 1812, and it's something that kind of hangs around and remains controversial in that next period of American history. All right. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Carla. Okay. So that's something that was at, now, if you want to see one of the first videos I ever made back in 2012, so as far as that goes, I made a video on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. I probably need to make another video that's a little bit more updated. But the importance of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions was that, in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, Jefferson and Madison authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now, Madison and Jefferson both believed that it was the role of the states to interpose when the federal government crossed the line. Now, both of these resolutions resolutions subscribe to the compact theory of the Constitution. The compact theory of the Constitution says that the Constitution is a compact between the states. So they were states' rights manifestos. Now, Jefferson went a bit further and endorsed the idea of nullification, that a single state could nullify a federal law if that state deemed it to be unconstitutional. Now, South Carolina is going to latch on to this later. But here's the thing. So really, Jefferson is giving Calhoun something to go ahead and start on, okay? But states' rights, what happens here is the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, there are states' rights, manifesto, but then when Jefferson and Madison get elected, they don't want to deal with the states' rights issue. It's like, we're in power now, we don't have to deal with it. States' rights is like kind of like this, when you're Chuck E. Cheese's and you got the moles, you got in you're trying to, and they keep going down and going up and going down and going up, and you're hitting at them, and that's states' rights. It's like, now you see it, now you don't. Now you see it, now you don't. And so that's really, but we see the articulation of this compact theory of the Constitution, which is something that's going to be a very popular constitutional theory all the way up to the American Civil War. It's like, when people ask, was the Civil War about slavery or states' rights? It's like the states' rights argument isn't without merit, because there's really, like, the people who founded the Confederate States of America, they subscribed to a view of the Constitution that was basically like, look, this is a contract between the states, and the states can, ultimately secede if they want to. All right. I would say here that, Edith, this is something that I would not necessarily put a lot of stock in. I can't really, off the top of my head, really come up with what that is. Okay, so I would say let's not even worry about that. That would be, now watch the DBQB on that or something like that this year. All right. So as far as that goes, let's see here. Now, McCulloch versus Maryland. This is a Commerce Clause case. Now, if you plan to take AP Government next year, don't forget about this one. All right. So the importance of the McCulloch versus Maryland case was that basically you had a steamship company that oh wait, never mind. Whoa, that was let me go back. Okay, sorry. I was thinking Gibbons versus Ogden. Okay. So McCulloch versus Maryland, that's a bank case. And so, of course, you've got John Marshall on one side. John Marshall was a Federalist judge. So it affirmed the bank's constitutionality, because the state of Maryland had tried to tax the bank. And so then John Marshall said, nope, supremacy clause. And he said that since the national bank is a constitutional entity, then it is a constitutional entity of the federal government, that the state cannot tax it because of the supremacy clause, okay, which says that federal law is higher than state law as long as the federal law is in accordance with the Constitution. So if the federal law is not in accordance with the Constitution, then it's struck down. But if the federal law is in accordance with the Constitution, then that's it. Okay, so as far as that's the importance of McCulloch versus Maryland, that it affirmed from the Supreme Court's view, the constitutionality of the bank. Now, of course, that's not going to stop Andrew Jackson from killing it later on, okay, because the court's just saying it's constitutional. It can't protect it from legislation and from it being allowed to expire. All right. So how did government policies influence the market economy? Okay, remember that you've got the tension between Henry Clay and, of course, the Democratic Party, where you've got that. But really, before the Civil War, government intervention in the economy was largely at a minimum. Tariffs were usually low. There wasn't a lot of money spent at the federal level on internal improvements. And the National Bank had a 20-year run, and then it's gone. Okay, so after Jackson, the National Bank is not a thing anymore. So I would say that really the market economy at this time was driven a lot by the government's laissez-faire stance to most of the extent. All right. And so this, Katie, I couldn't even begin to answer the question the time we have left, but we will be back next week, and we will focus on the Jacksonian era. So y'all just keep that in mind, and we will be back. Always good hanging out with y'all, and I will see y'all next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. It's always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.